But people keep using that phrase and throwing it at her.
Yeah,
Mario
yeah.
Kart is a fucking great writer. She writes.
Yeah, it's like what's forcing.
She writes a ton of excellent original shows that are all pretty great. I think.
Stop, okay?
I think anyone could have a show that's one of their favorites that she's written. Like, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Who are your parents?
I know Jeff is a huge Anohana fanboy, for instance.
Love that
But
Time to stop.
And
but like her
Okay, this is just a quick ramble about Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphan, since it's among the worst mecha series I've ever seen, and probably the single worst Gundam of all. For those of you waiting on the whopping 3 of you waiting on the Xenoblade vs. Dragon's Dogma video, that's coming soon, but this should tide you over if you're interested. By the way, to avoid content ID match, I'm superimposing some green screen footage so that this video doesn't get taken down for some stupid reason, even though it's completely still within fair use. So, throughout the first 3 episodes, the series is generally tolerable. The choreography is a complete mess, much like throughout the rest of the series. Things will happen for no apparent reason. The focus is on the wrong subjects, so things will just happen off-screen for the sake of contrivance. And it's pretty consistently all timed to the exact same song repeated for every single scene. Although the animation for the first 3 episodes is generally okay, there are some pretty glaring flaws at times for no apparent reason, other than the fact that the animators got lazy at very bad times. Of course, the already just above average animation falls drastically after the fact, but throughout all of it, the lighting is consistently terrible. For no apparent reason, the lights will just move just to fit the characters. Even when they're in a static room, it jumps around. Like, okay, take a look at this scene, for example. What the fuck is happening with those lights? That's not how light works. This is a pretty common problem throughout anime. That's something I can't really deny, but you can't for Velis will actually change how things look. Subsurface scattering will do that a little bit, but not much. However, no matter how it looks, Velis and both subsurface scattering won't make the light change like this at all. Just take a look at this scene, for example. The light is completely static, and yet somehow it casts shadows on Char's nose on either side when he rotates it like maybe a couple degrees. It appears on his lip in one cut and then disappears in the next. There's no shading on this far shot, and even though this other guy is standing directly parallel to him, the shadow is cast on the opposite side of his nose from McGillis's at the same time. It's really inconsistent and not very sensible at all. And then there's of course the problem that McGillis's nose basically looks like Michael Jackson's, except even more skeleton. That's a problem with many of the character designs actually, but I guess you can kind of hand-wave that as just an artistic choice, and that it's not particularly important. I find it looks like complete shit, though, especially compared to the many alternatives that could make it look like an actual nose, and not bone, I guess. Anyways, getting back to the choreography, it just gets worse over time. Eventually it reaches a point where the director, Nagai, actually thinks it's okay to have this nonsense. Like, okay, what am I looking at? This is supposed to be like some sort of elegant dance or something? Is it supposed to be effective? This isn't going to do anything, it's just wasted movement. And the worst part is that considering that this is supposed to emulate human movement, then there's nothing human about this in the slightest. There's nothing logical about this in the slightest. This is just a catastrophe. Although all things considered, it doesn't exactly come close to how bad the actual mecha designs are to begin with. The Grays is just a shitty Leo with, I don't know, a very, very mild coat of Armored Core paint slapped over it, but you won't be able to tell because it's spread so thinly. And then the Gundams are all completely atrocious. Exposed waist is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. It's not going to help you emulate human movement. There's no reason for it to not be at least slightly armored, and it just makes the entire thing look ridiculously unbalanced and very unwieldy. Regardless of how Ahab reactors somehow create gravitons or some shit, it's still vastly less effective than actually having something to protect that. Besides, I mean, just getting to the whole concept of emulating human movement as a mecha is ridiculous. Once something is 16 meters tall, everything changes. When you get down to them individually, the Barbatos is just stupid. It's literally just a throne. I mean, you can look at the concept art. They're basically identical. The Chimaris is also atrocious, but it mostly comes down to the ridiculously stupid palette that makes it look like some girl's toy, and the silly head. What that big horn on the top, I see no reason for it to be there, it just looks silly. Char's mobile suit, whatever it's supposed to be, it's not actually a Gundam, but it's like the prototype Graze or something, I forget its name. Everything about this is atrocious. The exposed parts are off the charts. The exposed parts are astoundingly simple, and make less sense for them to be exposed at all. The color is bland, and every segment of it, the legs, the arms, the torso, the head, they all look like they belong on a completely different mobile suit. It's incredibly incohesive, and the only thing holding it together in the slightest is the color palette. The very bland color palette. The fact that this is as popular as it is astounding. And despite all of this, it's still incredibly popular. The Grimgird is a meme, there's nothing good about it. All the character designs are not impressive in the slightest. Most of them have some sort of animal motive from the looks of things. It serves no purpose since those animals rarely actually have a very good representation of that character's personality, with very minor exceptions, and primarily if you stretch it an awful lot. If I recall correctly, the character designer was the same who worked on Build Fighters, which kind of makes it astounding that they're so consistently mediocre, because in actually the first Build Fighters, the character designer did at least a consistently decent job, and in Try, there were at least a couple characters that looked good and weren't just, boring or rip-offs. The lines around everyone's eyes are pretty obnoxious. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, however, it looks lazy, and if it was going to be used for something, it would probably represent eyeliner, for example. And without it, it just makes the eyes look a lot drier than they already do. Astonishingly, one of the only characters in which having that line would actually kind of make sense, it's not there in favor of having just mascara, and I would assume it's left absent to make that mascara look more distinct. However, I don't really think that works out particularly well when all the lines around every other character's eyes as well, and they also have eyelashes. It's a mess. Additionally, the character designs are bizarrely cartoony and childish, considering the subject matter of the story. Whenever things are actually pretty gritty, like Okada apparently intended it to be, but then the guy chickened out on a lot of it, it just makes it even more bizarre and juxtaposed. And that's not a good thing, like I have heard someone say it was in Madoka Magica, for example, because there's nothing to subvert. It's just a gritty show with really inappropriate character designs. And actually, regarding that grit, as it turns out, apparently, at least according to Okada, she planned on it being much grittier, but then Nagai ended up forcing her to tone it down. In either case, it would have been awful, because A, the grit primarily exists for shock value, and B, with it actually gone, it just kind of makes it more comical and boring. Take the Dort Workers' Rebellion, for example. They were supposedly massacred because of that, and then, as it turns out, because the plot had to progress, all of the characters just sort of, left and went down to Earth after it all happened. See, the funny thing about this is that it was actually all completely hand-waved as just completely fine, no problems here, once it was all said and done in like a 2-second scene. The entire Dort arc was basically just setting up an entire plot that could have probably lasted an entire series. In fact, it could probably last 3 series, because that's exactly what Universal Century was. Nevertheless, it's completely dismissed just to go to some random city in Canada where no one dies, which is another sign of the bad shock value being chickened out on. So Ein, who had been a comically insane character throughout the entire series, actually just suddenly appeared after getting turned into a robot and murdered 3 characters. And as it turns out, since all of those characters had names, none of them were dead. The next episode, they all just had minor injuries from that, so when Ein was ultimately defeated by Mikazuki's superior Nihon steel folded 1,000 times, it just made it all the more comical how little impact he actually had on anything. In fact, it was so comical, it's actually become a bit of a running joke for people to say that the characters aren't dead unless you see the light fade from their eyes, which is honestly probably true. And considering that we didn't see the light fade from Gailio's eyes, chances are he's going to return for Season 2 as well. By the way, did you know I have a long-lost brother? No, but the characters do. Several of them do, and it's astonishing how, coincidentally, they're always mentioned precisely before they happen to show up. Every single time. Actually, it only happens twice, if I can recall correctly. But in both instances, it's equally stupid how coincidental they just happen to show up immediately after they're mentioned. And there's also the absurdity of their actual role in the plot. Biscuit's brother is supposed to be some sort of, executive or something, I don't recall exactly. However, he sort of kidnaps his brother and Atra, because Atra was stupid enough to say that she was Kudelia. Which somehow the characters who decided to abduct them couldn't recognize that she obviously wasn't Kudelia in an age where Mars has been colonized and actually terraformed into a habitable environment, and engines that can create gravity. I would imagine that most people would recognize an emerging political figure like that who's actually having a pretty big impact, or at the very least they would be able to Google it and confirm their identity in a few seconds. Considering that these are members of the government, that just makes it all the more unbelievable. But again, Atra has to get beat up and interrogated by pretending to be someone she isn't for the sake of shock value, while Biscuit's brother just begins to spurg out because he screwed up again for the sake of drama. The fact that these workers were actually starting their rebellion based on Kudelia's sort of ideology or whatever it was, at least what they perceived it to be, and the idea that there was actually some awareness of this among the colony's higher-ups, at least if Biscuit's brother has anything to say about it, it's even worse, and even more insane that Kudelia would be completely unrecognizable. And then, of course, Fumitan had to apparently be a spy for some reason, and even though she already had basically no role in the plot to begin with, this just delayed everything even more so she could get killed off suddenly in a dramatic way, as to show her her true allegiance to Kudelia, even though she died and still had no impact on the plot, of course. Getting back to the ridiculous brothers, there's actually Akihiro's younger brother, who, in this pirate arc, is one of the slaves of this cartoonishly over-designed villain, and his captain, who is also cartoonishly over-designed, and also 2 more instances of really bad animal motives. Akihiro's brother then decides to commit suicide by this very inconsistently powered hammer that is actually animated in a way that would be physically impossible. This is another instance of the stupid choreography, by the way, and for the sake of drama. He apparently this should most likely be to depict that as human debris and a slave he was and just sort of indoctrinated into thinking he's worthless, which we already sort of saw with Akihiro earlier on. The thing is, he literally comes off as completely insane here, and also his choice to sacrifice himself for the sake of his brother suddenly with no real foreshadowing or any build-up whatsoever. It's just impossible to sort of take his death seriously when he died to this joke immediately after he was introduced at that. Thematically, it doesn't work to begin with, because as human debris, which I'm going to assume is supposed to be a metaphor for what I have heard, orphans have been called throwaway children in Japan. I'm not completely certain on that, so don't quote me on it. And if that is the case, although they are somewhat depressed due to lacking connections and family, which is the real problem with being an orphan there, aside from, at least as far as I know, no welfare. But more importantly, it more or less means it's hard to get a job, and you're probably guaranteed to be a salaryman unless you happen to be really lucky and get into college. Even then, the likelihood of someone actually finding out about it isn't particularly high. It also lacks any substance whatsoever beyond analogy. It doesn't have any implications of what this sort of problem would lead to. It doesn't have any commentary on what caused it or anything like that. It's simply, look, orphans are treated poorly or something. Yay! And with boring characters, bad action, and an incredibly slow plot. After Tekkadan actually gets off of Mars after the first 3 episodes, it's just delays, and detours and detours and detours. There's nothing that actually happens throughout most of that aside from characters getting introduced and killed off for the sake of a Gundam. A Gundam that is often completely removed from the choreography, I might add. Who cares about these characters being in a bar drinking? This doesn't add anything to their personality we don't already know. It doesn't affect the plot in any way. This has nothing to do with theming either. It's ridiculous. Who cares if Mikazuki thinks his name looks better in katakana or something? Who cares about this entire episode that Nagai and Co. spent stalling with this ridiculous ritual that could have probably just been passed over in about 10 seconds or something, or just cut entirely for the sake of something more important? It adds nothing. Oh hey, look at this joke character who can't accomplish anything because they're obsessed with pride and they're a joke character. Now we're going to use them to suddenly kill off one of the main protagonists rather than a character that can actually be taken seriously, and then we're going to have a bunch of drama about this for an entire episode in place of plot progression. In place of character development, even. Both of which never happen until the very end of this entire episode. Then, when she actually reappears like a complete retard and then immediately gets killed off in another dramatic way, and in the process depicting the actions of Tekkadan as horrifying, even though that throughout the entire series this is the exact same thing they've been doing and been glorifying. Is there any theming to this contradiction? No, there isn't. It's just here. It's just here because because Okada is a hack and Nagai is a hack. By the way, do you remember all that build-up about Mikazuki being a violent adrenaline junkie? As it turns out, that we're gonna completely drop that and just have a happy ending where he gets 2 girls, because harems. That's this harem that contributes nothing to the plot whatsoever. Here's an episode we spend on a farm, talking about how cheap-ass corn is, because corn is cheap as fuck. Because it's just filler. Just like this entire episode. Oh look, Mikazuki got to meet Char and Garma. Did they have any reason to be here? No, they just happened to be passing by this entire corn farm that's sort of in the middle of nowhere. So speaking of Char, you wanna know why I'm calling him Char? Because I can't remember his actual name, and I'm not going to use that stupid forced nickname that Okada came up for him. The only 2 names that I can think of when I do think of Char are Char and Quattro. I can't be bothered to look up what his actual name is, but see, as a Char clone, this guy is an awful one. Most supposed Char clones are just an archetype anyways, there's nothing particularly special about him, but the big problem with this Char clone is the fact that he's basically meme Char. Cold and calculating, is a complete pedophile, betrays all of his friends. Oh man, he's so genius, right? The thing is, all of this completely misses the point of Char's character to begin with, in the fact that he was completely butthurt and driven by his emotions. He was a humongous man-child. Anyways, that's all there is to this one. I can't be bothered to do anymore because I'm exhausted, and I hate thinking about this show because it's legitimately painful. So, if you're interested in the Xenoblade vs. Dragon's Dogma video, which is going to be significantly more thorough, and also have an actual script, so it's also going to be much more well-constructed, that will be coming in the near future, I suppose. It'll also have a point to exist beyond just dissing something.